Iran is one of few countries whose changes in leadership can legitimately be said to be of global significance. And just such a crucial change will occur in mid-June when Iranians go to the polls to elect a new president. Current President Hassan Rouhani has received relatively favorable treatment in the international media for being a moderate, but he is constitutionally barred from standing for a third consecutive term and has seen his platform of international engagement increasingly challenged, particularly during the years of the Trump administration. What will the public's final verdict be on his presidency? Who will stand to replace him? And what do political labels such as moderate, hardliner, and reformist even mean in an Iranian context? And how representative should we take the elections to be of the public's genuine wishes? Discussing these issues with me today is probably the country's foremost political commentator to the international media, Tehran University professor and chair of American Studies, Seyed Mohammad Marandi. Professor, thank you very much for making the time.
Thank you for having me.
So as it stands, the election will be happening on June the 18th, but given the state of the coronavirus pandemic, has there been any talk of it perhaps being postponed until a larger segment of the population is vaccinated?
I haven't heard of any talk of it being delayed, so my assumption is that it will take place on the day in which it was planned beforehand. That's a good point that you make, especially since we've had a huge surge in the number of cases over the past few weeks. So it was the Iranian New Year, and I think the government mismanaged the situation because they relaxed all the restrictions, or at least they didn't put in any real restrictions for the Iranian New Year and the holiday. And now the number of cases have shot up very dramatically. So will they be able to contain the situation in time for the election? I don't know, but we'll see.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question is there a consensus or something approaching a national consensus on how the government has handled the pandemic and what kind of criticisms have been made and from whom?
There has been a lot of criticism of the Rouhani administration, especially during two periods. One was last New Year, the Iranian New Year, which is the first day of spring, when the government shutdown was delayed. There was a shutdown, not like in Australia and Europe. In Iran, it's much more relaxed, but still there was a shutdown. It was delayed last time and the government was criticized for the delay. This year, there was no real shutdown. There were just some restrictions that existed beforehand and they continued during the Iranian New Year. But since people mingle a lot, they go on trips, usually, and since there were no restrictions, the Iranians behaved more or less as if it was a normal situation. The only difference was that many wore masks. And this has caused a huge upsurge. The Minister of Health was protesting and complaining during the past few weeks, but he's also being criticized for not being forceful enough and not pushing the president to change policy and to put in restrictions. So at the moment, the administration is being criticized a lot from all quarters.
Concurrently with this, as I'm sure you've been speaking to many on this subject, is the parallel attempts to revive the international nuclear agreement. So is the fact that that is happening more or less coincident, or will happen more or less coincident with the election, help whoever runs on Rouhani's platform? And what kind of support does such a platform now enjoy, do you think?
I don't really have an answer. It's very difficult to gauge how things will progress. I don't think anyone will want to be seen with President Rouhani or to be seen as his candidate, no matter who that person is, because President Rouhani is not popular at all, and he's very low in the polls, extraordinarily low in the polls. I mean, it's not all his fault. I do think he is to blame, but the coronavirus also has a major role. Whether the government mismanaged the situation or not, it's not something that's going to make life easier. And of course, we had the maximum pressure sanctions, and both these at the same time made it more difficult. While I am personally very unhappy with the president, I do have to point out that because of the sanctions, the government's ability to deal with the coronavirus is much more problematic, because shutdowns mean that you have to help people and the government has to give people support. And when you have sanctions, that basically means the government doesn't have much in reserves to use to support the public, to keep them at home. And governments like South Korea, they have billions of dollars of Iranian money held in their accounts, but they won't hand it over to the Iranian government because of the United States, because Biden and before him Trump have ordered the Koreans to withhold the money.
These are payments for oil shipments.
They are mostly payments for oil shipments, but in the case of, for example, Iraq, it's also Iranian gas that's being exported to Iraq, Iranian electricity that's exported to Iraq, and other goods and services that the Iranians have given to that country. So you have billions of dollars being held in Iraq, in South Korea, in the UK. A large amount of money is being held, and Japan. So Iran has lots of money in different countries, which it has no access to, and it has problems exporting and importing all sorts of goods, including oil. But and I should add that the United States has made Iran's ability to purchase sanctions very limited, because it's very difficult for Iran to move money around in order to purchase vaccines, because the US has blocked Iran from using the international banking system. And they've intensified it during the coronavirus pandemic to make the virus more hurtful to Iranian society. In other words, the United States, to be very, very blunt, the United States has used the coronavirus as a biological weapon against the Iranians. So the Iranians then decided to develop their own vaccine, which has now been developed, and it will soon be mass produced. But the Americans sanctioned those very same institutions that were involved in vaccine production. So they tried to slow down Iran's vaccine production as much as possible. They tried to prevent Iran from purchasing vaccines, and they've been trying to prevent Iran from importing masks and test kits and other equipment, and ventilators. But now, of course, Iran produces all of these inside the country. But in any case, all of this has caused the pandemic to be worse. And so you can't, or I can't really blame President Rouhani for everything. But in any case, he's not currently popular. So going back to your question, I don't think anyone right now would want to be seen as having President Rouhani's support. And it's sort of like, I don't want to make a comparison, because I think George Bush was infinitely morally inferior to anyone in Iranian politics. But it's sort of like at the end of George Bush's second administration, Uh, None of the, no one wanted to be seen as having his support, sort of, because he had become so unpopular over the Iraq War.
Well,
So
in
different.
terms of, sorry to interrupt you there, but in terms of maybe predicting what kind of political shifts will happen as a result of his unpopularity, I think it'd probably be beneficial to maybe define the kind of terms that we so often hear in the international media. Rouhani is described as being a moderate. We also hear mainly about politics being a dichotomy between hardliners and reformists. So how should particularly people in Western countries make sense of these labels? What do they actually mean politically? And what are the real political fault lines?
It's difficult to explain because Iranian politics are complicated, they're fluid, and there are no real powerful political parties. So the alliances are constantly shifting and changing. I would say that the term hardliners versus moderates is misleading, but I think that you could divide Iranian politics into, let's say, those who have a hardline stance against the United States, who are very skeptical of the Americans and do not want to have anything to do with them because they believe that the United States will not fulfill any of its obligations under any circumstances, unless the United States suddenly falls into some deep decline where it has to change fundamentally. Then you have, let's say, the more you have the more centrist, let's say, conservatives or principalists, as they call themselves. They are more skeptical of the United States than the so-called moderates or the reformists, but they don't take the approach of those who have this really hardline stance. And I would say that those who take this hardline approach and the principalists, politically, they are left-leaning on the whole.
In terms of economically speaking?
In terms of economic policy, in terms of social policy, they're more family-oriented, let's say. I would say in general that all of the political persuasions are compared to what you would have in Europe or Australia or the United States, they would be more to the right when it comes to family
culturally
values.
Conservative.
Culturally conservative. But when it comes to social policy, I would say that the principalists or the conservatives, however they're described, or the so-called hardliners, there's them as well, that they would be more left-leaning, and especially the so-called hardliners, I think they are very left-leaning. So, very social justice, a lot of stress is put on social justice, very anti-capitalist, not necessarily anti-private sector, but anti-capitalist. In other words, they're not opposed to private wealth, but they're against capitalism and liberalism altogether in that respect. So then you have the moderates, the so-called moderates, people like President Rouhani, who are more liberal, and they're very much into liberal politics. With regards to social issues, they're more liberal, and with regards to economic policy, they're very liberal. Then you have the reform
right-wing.
Sorry?
In terms of like right-wing economic policy, like more
Yes,
free
they're more
market.
right. That's right. So when it's social regarding again cultural values and cultural politics, they're more liberal, and when it comes to economic policy, they're very liberal. Again, I'm speaking in relative terms because I think that any of these groups or these subgroups that I'm naming, if they were in Australia or in England, when it comes to cultural values, they would not be considered liberal. But then you have the reformists, who I would again divide into two groups. One would be the sort of centrist reformists who have a lot in common, a lot more in common with the principalists or the conservatives. In many cases, there's a lot of overlap, but they are, again, culturally liberal and politically liberal as well. Then you have the radical reformists, who I think are pro-Western. They're usually more pro-Western than any of the other factions. So you do have these, I mean, they're more pro-Western in many ways, in politics and culture and society, but Western as in political establishment Western. So the irony is that in many ways, and this may be confusing to your audience, but in many ways, the principalists or the hardliners would have a lot in common and a lot to talk about with some segments of American and European society, and the reformists, especially the radical reformists, would have a lot in common with another segment of different Western societies.
So in a sense, there's like the difference would be that in Western countries, usually those who are economically left-leaning are also much more culturally liberal, and those advocating more capitalist politics are more culturally conservative. But this sounds like much more of a...
Yes, you're right. It's different here.
Yeah, so there would be a lot of, at least in terms of economic policy, probably a lot that very left-wing Western politicians might agree with the so-called hardliners on, but not in cultural areas.
Yes, I agree. I think that's more or less it. And among the radical reformists, especially, they would have a lot in common with the New York Times, CNN, and
that kind of view of the world.
The BBC, yes, that sort of worldview.
So it sounds like at least partially the divide is some version of the left-wing, right-wing economic divide that is present more or less everywhere.
Yeah, but again, I would stress that these 5 groups that I've mentioned, you could even divide them into more subgroups. But yes, I would say that the principalists, the more centrist principalists, and the so-called hardliners opposed to the United States, that they are culturally, in Western terms, more to the right, and when it comes to social values and social justice, they are more to the left.
Mm.
And then on the other hand, among the different reformist factions, let's say, they are less to the right culturally, because they're still to the right when we compare to Europe and the United States. They're less to the right, but when it comes to social justice and economics, they are they would be very compatible to liberal capitalism, the dominant values that currently exist in much of Western countries.
Mm. Well,
and the moderates, they sort of shift around. They're
And the president belongs to this this faction that shifts.
Yes, and I think the moderates are, I mean, the centrists or the moderates, because these are all self-definitions. I mean, when you say the principalists, obviously the moderates consider themselves to have principles, and the reformists consider themselves principles, or the principalists or the conservatives consider themselves to be reformists. But these are the labels that are currently used. Everyone considers himself to be moderate in his own worldview, and whether he is in a reformist camp or she is in the principalist camp, they use those labels differently when they describe themselves, obviously.
Well, it seems, and correct me if you think differently, when the current president first came to power, when he was running in the elections, it seemed that many of these factions really came together to support his candidacy. Most importantly among them, another former president, Rafsanjani, who maybe you could shed more light on his influence, who seemed very much to represent the private economy and the more capitalist-oriented sections of the political sphere. He also seemed to receive support from the then Parliament Speaker, Larijani, who I believe is a principalist, as you described them. So even if no one wants to be tarred by the legacy of Rouhani, do you think some kind of coalition might appear again and put forward another consensus candidate? And do you think that's what happened originally?
I don't think that Rouhani was voted in because of anyone's backing. I'm not sure if Dr. Larijani supported him. I think that Dr. Larijani, the Speaker of Parliament back then, didn't make a clear stance, but I'll have to go back and look that up. But former President Rafsanjani, who you mentioned, yes, he supported him. The reformists were doing very poorly, their candidate, so they stepped out of the race and they supported him. But I don't think he was still going to lose until the last debate. In the last debate, the other candidates got into an argument, and he did very well in that debate. So,
this is Rouhani that you're saying was
President
on track
Rouhani
to lose. Okay.
Yes, in the polls, he was doing very poorly until a week before the election, and he was consistently down. And the person who was in the polls, well ahead of everyone else, was the former mayor of Tehran and the current head of parliament, Mr. Ghalibaf. So he was expected to win.
And he's a principalist.
And he's a, let's say, centrist principalist. He was expected to win. And then suddenly in the last debate, Rouhani outperformed everyone else by far, and something clicked. And, in the daily polls that were carried out, it looked like someone climbing a mountain. It was just, he was just going up. It was a straight line up towards the 50%. He was like down at something like 12-13%, and then within 7 days, he in the polls he reached 50%, almost 50%, and on election day he got 50% of the vote. Some of his supporters voted for him, even though he was their second priority. But they were fearful of a third candidate, and I don't want to confuse your audience, so I won't go there. But he won the election, and he's been president for 2 terms now.
But it sounds like by less than previous presidents have won.
Yes, previous candidates were pretty popular when they came in first. President Rafsanjani, who you mentioned earlier, he was back then when he first became president. He was he was a person who spoke a lot about social justice, and he sort of changed during his presidency. So he became more liberal. But when he became president, he was seen as left-leaning. And let me also point out something to further confuse your audience, and that is that Iranian politics has shifted a lot. In other words, those people who are now the reformists, especially the radical reformists, they were in the 1980s and the 1990s, the hardliners. It was sort of the other way around.
What Ahmadinejad was in his presidency, more or less.
Well, Mr. Ahmadinejad comes in much later, but in the 1980s and the 1990s, those who were considered to be like the hardcore reformists or the radical reformists, they were the hardliners, let's say, with regards to U.S. policy, and they were also very left-leaning. And they suddenly shifted in the mid 1990s, sort of like how, and I don't want to make I don't want to. I'm just giving this as an example, but how the neocons were leftists, and then they almost collectively transformed into something else. I don't mean to say they're like the neocons, but so like there was a radical change, and it was sort of like collective. It was the whole. So their politics. They were very critical of the West, and then they suddenly became much more supportive of the West after President Khatami became the sitting president. So Mr. Rafsanjani, when he first became president, he was very popular. Mr. Khatami, when he first became president, he was very popular. Mr. Ahmadinejad, when he first became president, he was also very popular for differing reasons and for similar reasons. But President Rouhani never attained that popularity. Of course, all of them were polarizing figures in their own way, but in any case, Mr. Rouhani was never a very popular president.
Never overwhelmingly popular.
He became somewhat popular after the JCPOA was signed, and people thought that the troubles were over, and the skeptics of the deal were sort of isolated. But then when the Americans began to violate the agreement from almost literally day one, and Obama never fulfilled his obligations, then the skeptics and the so hardliner critics of the U.S., they began to say, "I told you so," and that began to sort of eat away at his briefly gained popularity.
So to turn our minds back to the upcoming election, from what I read, quite a few people, and this often seems to be the case, quite a few people put their names forward. Of those that have, are there any that you feel are particularly likely to see on the ballot on June the 18th?
There are lots of names, and some of them are definitely not serious. And in any case, Iranian politics, as I said before, is very fluid. And because, according to the law, the campaigning starts shortly before the election itself, there's only 2-3 weeks where they really can campaign. Therefore, everything will be determined then, and or a lot will be determined then. And the debates will have an enormous impact as well. So in previous elections, except for Mr. Rafsanjani when he became president, and back then he was the only heavyweight candidate. But when Mr. Khatami stood for presidency, no one took him seriously, but he won. When Mr. Ahmadinejad stood for presidency, no one took him seriously, but he won. And the same is true with Mr. Rouhani. So that shows basically how unpredictable the the future is with regards to the election of the president. So I would be very cautious, and probably if I told you who I thought would win, I would probably be wrong at this stage. So I wouldn't want to go there on a recorded program, so where someone could about what I said.
But as you mentioned, unpredictable, you mentioned the predecessor of President Rouhani, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. He has, it seems, continued to be a very polarizing figure after the end of his presidency. Can you maybe shed a bit of light on that? And how does he and his faction of supporters fit into the kind of political spectrum that you described? And how much of a force do they remain in politics?
That's complicated because like many of the other politicians, or some of the other politicians at least, he has shifted. When he became president, what made him popular was because it was his left-leaning economic policies and his support, his talk of social justice. Now, how, whether he was successful or not, that's a different story, but he was seen as a man of the people. And so many of those who felt disenfranchised, those who believe that the system is unfair and unequal, they supported him, and he did some things that were quite good. And I think he made some very big mistakes as well by not listening to advisors who were experts in different areas. He made a lot. I think he's a smart person, obviously, like all those people who get to the top, they have to be smart. But I think he was too self-confident in his own decisions. But in any case, he was like, he didn't dress very well. He dressed like an ordinary person on the streets, and he mingled with people, and so that made him very popular. And the elites didn't like him, and I don't mean just political elites. I mean sort of like wealthy, elites, or people who even, university students who go to really good universities. Many of them didn't like him. He was, sort of seen as
looked
very
down
different.
upon.
Yeah, sort of, yeah. And that's why when he went for re-election, there were riots in Tehran, because in the north of Tehran, where the more wealthy people live, overwhelmingly they voted against him. And in the south of Tehran, where he was very popular, people voted for him. So when the results came out, people in the north of Tehran couldn't believe those results, because they looked around them and at the voting stations, and when there was claimed there was fraud, many easily believed it. But in reality, he won basically because the middle class, the lower middle class, and the more disenfranchised voted for him. And, as in everywhere else in the world, that is usually the majority. So he was very polarizing, but he was not smart enough, or let's say he was not humble enough, let's say, to try to bridge the divide in a way in which, it could improve the situation. So
because he had quite a habit, didn't he, of publicly accusing very prominent figures, including former President Rafsanjani, of various financial misconduct, basically.
In general, he was a provocative person, and he still is. He likes to provoke. And, like one of the things that I used to dread was when he would go and start talking about the Holocaust. And he was basically trying to provoke and say, you don't have free speech, that's why you react. So he never actually said that there was no Holocaust, although I'd have to check to be sure. I'm growing old, so I have to be careful about the past. I don't know, but I think he would question it and a lot, or the numbers or the scope, and he would just do it to sort of, I think, because it sort of went down well in much of the global South. The whole notion that someone was, I don't know, making the Western governments and elites angry. But the point was that he was very provocative in general. And so whenever I went on television, I had to say, look, he's trying to raise this as an issue of freedom of speech. And you're saying, in Western countries where you constantly talk about freedom of speech, but, you on many issues, your media will not allow open discussion. So he's just using this as a tool but he would cause me a lot of grief because of his provocative behavior on the international team. The reason why I say this is because I'm sort of trying to show how he works when it comes to domestic politics as well. So he would make accusations, and in many cases, he never provided the evidence. So,
but that too might have fed into his popularity as well. Do you think?
Definitely, yes. When I say I'm going to expose how the ruling class does this or how this politician does that, it does create a certain popularity, not just among the elites, among everyone. It's not something necessarily class-based or anything like that. But in some cases, he did provide evidence of some people. In some cases, he never provided evidence. He never had evidence. So, but in general, he is a sort of provocative person, and that keeps him. And I think my interpretation, I may be unfair to him, but I think he liked being in the spotlight. So while I felt that his, some of the things that he would say at the UN when it came to different issues, it was not well presented, as the example I gave before. I would say that in Iranian politics, he had the same problem, but, he was well known across the world, and he was, talked about a lot in Iran. So he was very polarizing, and I think that he contributed to intensifying that polarization, both at home and abroad. But I don't think they're going to allow him to run as president, because there's a general policy that former presidents, it's unwritten, cannot stand, but also because of his some people around him have financial issues and other issues, or accusations are directed toward them. I don't think he'll be allowed to stand, but that remains to be seen. But he does have support among a lot of people who are disenfranchised. He does so as we speak. But those votes are more or less transferable to others. In other words, if people from his base see that there's a candidate who may be completely opposed to him as an individual, but who speak of social justice and equality and move that agenda forward, they'll switch to that person, probably.
Well, given that you say that it's an unwritten rule that former presidents shouldn't return to the presidency after they've had 2 terms, if he were to mobilize this support, or mobilize enough support, do you think that would tip the scales in his favor and allow?
I don't think he has that capacity, because, as I said, his support base, many of them had in previous instances supported let's go back 4 years, when during the re-election of Mr. Rouhani, let's say the major principalist candidate who lost to Rouhani, which was expected. In Iran, the incumbent always wins. It's, there's it would be shocking if he didn't. But Ahmadinejad's attempt 4 years ago, he tried to stand for election, and they didn't approve his candidacy. But his support base, many of them turned to Mr. Raisi, who was one of the candidates opposing President Rouhani.
And the current
now
chief of the judiciary.
Now he is the chief of the judiciary. Yes,
Mm-hmm.
yes, he is the chief of the judiciary. So most of his hardcore supporters, I don't mean like the people around him, I mean the general class of people who supported him, back then supported Mr. Raisi.
I mean, maybe if we entertain the possibility, were he allowed to, how do you think he would do, given what you've said about his support?
I don't know. I mean, currently in the polls, he is running second. But the person who he's running second to is Mr. Raisi, the current head of the judiciary, the person who lost the presidential run 4 years ago. So he's doing the best at the moment, because since he became the head of the judiciary, he's been seen as anti-corruption, and he's been seen to be successful. Although I don't know, if how true that is. I don't know a great deal about the judiciary and its functioning, but there's a general public perception that he is doing things and dealing with corruption, and he's against. So for example, in this wealthy part of this wealthy area near Tehran, more or less wealthy, there was a lot of land where a lot of rich people took illegally, and he went there and supported the courts and taking that land back and destroying some of these massive villas, and that went down well. But that was one example. So that sort of thing helped him become more popular. So at the moment, Mr. Raisi is more popular than Mr. Ahmadinejad, and a lot of the people who supported Mr. Ahmadinejad support Mr. Raisi, although Mr. Raisi is much more, he's less provocative. He's not provocative. He's more, careful in his manners and speech and so on. He's more, but because you're speaking about hypotheticals, if there are debates and you're a provocative person, that could change, many things. So if you and I were to engage in an argument and one of us was just willing to go anywhere, who knows what sort of impact that would have on the discussion.
Well, you mentioned polling, and in terms of who's more popular internally, I'm imagining these are domestic polls, which I think international observers are often quite hesitant to take seriously as being a genuine reflection of popular will. But there are, as you can probably expand on, international polling companies that carry out work in Iran and have confirmed a few of the things that you've described.
Well, I'd be careful about that, because when we say internationally, we usually mean Western.
Yes.
And in the West, they are skeptical of anything that they don't approve of. The polling, there are at least 4 polling centers in Iran that are very well established, and they're all quite good. I would say 2 of them are very good, and they've been accurate over the past, let's say, 12 years that I've been acquainted with their work. Over the past 12 years, they've always been very accurate. So I would in no way whatsoever give greater credibility to Western polling institutions. than those that exist in Iran. But having said that, you're correct that, for example, there are, like the University of Maryland, among others, that they carry out their own polls, and they come with results that are similar. And one of the reasons why one of the things that, and I'm not an expert on polling, but one of the things that sort of helps to validate polling is that this consistency that comes out in with regards to certain issues. So there's clearly a pattern. Let's say you can tell that, for example, a particular politician is popular when all the different polls, whether they are Western funded polls or whether they're locally uh, uh, funded polling institutions that carry out these polls, there's a credit. It shows there's a credit that they're
They're
credible.
onto something.
Yes, and then when President Rouhani, gets 50% of the poll, the votes, or in his re-election 56 or 57, and the polls did, at least one of the polls was like 56%, and he got 56 point something percent. So, these polling institutions should be taken very seriously, and I would be careful about saying international observers, because it's not like Brazilians who are questioning Iranian numbers, or Argentina, or people from Argentina, or from Venezuela or South Africa or India. It's usually the United States and those countries, or that are politically aligned to the United States, that will use that sort of narrative. Because one thing I would like stress here, and I'm wondering how boring this is to your audience, because I'm talking about things which they're not dealing with on a day-to-day basis. But and they have their own politics and local politics, which they know a great deal about, and I know nothing. So if you start explaining to me Australian politics, I'm sure it would be very difficult for me to follow, because I don't know the complexities. But in general, what I would say is that just to show why I'm saying that we have to be careful about the terminology. In Western countries, the narrative about the international community is usually the United States and its allies. So when they say the international community is concerned, they mean we in NATO and our friends are concerned, and not necessarily everyone in NATO, but those who dominate NATO. Or, for example, you have this long-running narrative on Iran that Iran is corrupt, it's mismanaged, it's the regime. They like to use the word regime to sort of delegitimize it. The regime is unpopular, it's imploding, it's and all these things. Yet, and we've been hearing it for many years. Yet, on the other hand, it's a rising threat, it's a rising menace, it's a threat to the global security, as if, like, I don't know, Argentina and Chile are somehow threatened by Iran. But and you have this irresolvable paradox where something on the one hand is supposedly constantly collapsing, yet on the other hand, it's becoming a rising menace to the world. You can't have it both ways. But since both are demonizing and they fit in with this, backward, ugly, medieval Iran that exists in the broader narrative, even though they're inconsistent with each other, they are somehow both believable simultaneously by many, even though you can't have both at the same time. So narrative building is very important, and I think it guides the way in which many people see things. So so I think that's probably the biggest problem that we confront. And I think it's not just when it comes to Iran. I think it's in the United States, a problem that many progressives face, the way in which they're, let's say the dominant media, the liberal media, the media that's controlled by the elites, the way in which they depict U.S. politics puts those who don't have a media outlet of their own at a great disadvantage, because they're labeled in a way in which, no matter how hard they try, it's very difficult for them to gain influence. So, the Republicans have Fox News and Breitbart and others. The Democrats have, MSNBC, CNN, the New York Times, ABC, NBC, CBS. But, those who are outside of that framework, that broader framework, don't have a voice. So, and when they're labeled, it's very difficult for them to do anything about it. So I would say that countries like Iran have that problem because they don't have much of a voice. So either very few people will look to seek the reality, or they would, and it would be difficult to sort of break the narratives, even if you want to sort of see if it's different from what you hear. There's still this very powerful, this latent knowledge of Iran that has been produced through these narratives that would constantly be a challenge that prevents people, that would impede people from recognizing Iran for what it is.
Well, latching on to the word narrative that you use, to bring it back to domestic politics and to bring it back to the pandemic, has there been a sort of general societal shift that you've noticed in terms of support for certain kind of politics that didn't exist previously? So again, are people more left-leaning than, more left-leaning in their economic feelings?
Definitely. Yeah. I think that in general, a large segment of Iranian society has always been left-leaning in economics. But I think that now, not just because of the pandemic, but also because of the sanctions. And, the sanctions, even though they have nothing to do directly with local politics, but when life becomes more difficult for the majority, then the injustices become more visible. The wealthy flouting their wealth and their, expensive cars and their, and that sort of thing. So the pandemic, the sanctions, and the liberal policies of the current administration, all of these combined, and I think the global changes as well, all of these combined have, I think, strengthened the, let's say, ideological left in Iran. And again, as I said before, the ideological left in Iran doesn't necessarily mean the exact same thing as in, let's say, England or in Australia, but those who,
the economic left.
Yes, social justice is more important, I think, today than it has been for the last 30 years.
And based on, again, the spectrum that you laid out before, that kind of environment sounds more favorable to the principalist hardliner, so-called, end of the spectrum that you described.
It gives them a certain advantage, but it's unclear because, as I said, the debates and will have a huge impact, and the campaign will have a huge impact, and personal charisma will have a huge impact, and it could shift away to someone else, someone completely unexpected who may be from a different ideological persuasion. So, I wouldn't bet on it if I was a betting man, which I'm not. But I would say that a candidate, if I was an advisor to a candidate, I would, social justice would be number one on the list. And according to polls, that is the first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth issue at the top of the priority list of ordinary people. It all has to do with economics, whether it's inflation or jobs or injustice or whatever. It's first and foremost jobs and inflation, but you know, in general, those issues that have to do with the economy and the well-being, you know, is especially important for those who are more vulnerable. So such a person would probably have an advantage, but that doesn't mean he'll, you know, he'll win. I think a lot of people in Iran would probably be willing to switch their votes during the campaign. I mean, remember, the same people, the same women, the same men, the same young people, the same old people who voted for Khatami, former President Khatami, voted for President Ahmadinejad. And many of the same people who voted for President Ahmadinejad voted for President Rouhani. But these people are from different political persuasions. So there's a sort of group in Iranian society who would consider themselves to be, let's say, generally speaking, reformists, maybe 15%, 20% changes. Then on the other side of the political spectrum, you'd have something similar to that. But the majority of Iranians are sort of somewhere in between. So they could be persuaded, but in general, because of the inequalities and the economic problems, someone who pursues a narrative of social justice that sort of person would have an advantage at this stage.
And are there issues of national political importance that people outside of Iran might not have heard of at all, apart from universal things like economic inequality and foreign policy? What issues are of national importance?
Well, one of the things that, and this is why I always say that, when they say the international community is skeptical about this or they question that, and when I say it's usually in the West, for years, for example, I would be telling reporters based in the United States and Europe, or politicians who come to see me, or diplomats who see me, or who we meet either in Iran or abroad, that overwhelmingly Iranians support the government's regional policy, the state's regional policy. And they would always look at this with skepticism. And then when General Soleimani was murdered by Trump, he was seen as a hero, and his funeral was unprecedented. So his funeral, which the procession went through a number of cities, you had millions of people, many millions of people participating in not even the largest city of Iran. And then in Tehran, it was extraordinary. There was a sea of people. And in Iraq, I mean, the Americans and the Western media always says how Iraqis hate the Iranians, and that's wishful thinking, or at least, they listen to those people who surround them, their embassies, their friends, those who are friendly to embassies, the people who will say what they want to hear. But the funeral procession in Iraq was similar to what we saw in Iran. You had hundreds of thousands of people participating in not huge cities in the funeral of General Soleimani. So, afterwards, I would always tell my Western counterparts or diplomats or journalists that, look, this is the reality of Iran that you failed to see. And the reality of Iraq, I mean, I'm not saying everyone in Iraq supports Iran, but, you'd have, let's say a couple of hundred people would go and burn the Iranian consulate somewhere, let's say in Karbala. And then the Western media would say how Iraqis despise Iran. Most of these people were belong to Western-funded NGOs. But they would use those people or their protests of a couple of thousand people here, a few hundred people there, as evidence of Iran's sheer, the sheer hatred of Iraqis towards Iran. Yet, when General Soleimani was murdered, you had these huge crowds. They suddenly didn't present it, those crowds as evidence of Iran's popularity or
Soleimani's personal popularity.
Yes, and of course, General Soleimani was symbolic of, the Islamic Republic of Iran. So, or afterwards, the protests in Baghdad, which was well over 1 million people demanding the Americans leave, and they never left. Of course, they ignored the Iraqi people, and they still continue to occupy the country. But the point that I'm making is that one thing that in the West they try to ignore or they distort is that Iranians support the government's regional policy in fighting against ISIS, and whether it's in Syria or in Iraq, and Iran's opposition to apartheid in Palestine. So they want to believe that Iran is different. And this is a problem that Western diplomats and journalists in Iran that are even based in Iran often have, because they're usually based in the more wealthy parts of the city. And so the people who surround them, who they go to and see in parties and so on, they're often like-minded. So they'll think that this is how Iranians think, and which is, this is how some Iranians definitely think, but it's not how all Iranians think. And another thing about Iran, which I don't know how similar it is to Australia, but Iranians are generally very critical. So if you get into a taxi, you're never going to see, I can't say never, but you'll rarely see a taxi driver say something good about the government, whoever is in charge, But but the same taxi driver who will be saying all sorts of, things about, the government, he was probably in the funeral of General Soleimani, let's say. So I think that often Western journalists and Western diplomats, they're not sophisticated enough to see this problem that they have. And in many cases, because of the nature of their jobs, they really can't afford to go too deep into these issues, because then at home or from where they work, they'll be seen as, I think, losing credibility, because the general narrative is very much different from these complicated realities, and then if they go down that road, then they'll be seen as somehow losing their moral compass or losing their objectivity or being influenced by, and they will lose their credibility.
Well, to run with the issue of foreign policy, we obviously couldn't complete this conversation without referring to the nuclear agreement. Do you have any strong expectations about whether it will survive, and might it collapse as a result of whoever wins the election, if nothing else than if the United States, for example, were to use it as an opportunity to put a final nail in the coffin?
Since none of the major politicians, are saying that they're going to tear up the agreement, I don't think it's going to be necessarily a game changer or something very big. But those who are, it could be one of the issues. It depends on how the debates go and what the polling says then. It could be a factor, but it would have to depend on the debates. But the agreement is not something that is looked upon as it was when it was signed. There's much more skepticism towards US intentions now, and especially after the attack on the sabotage that was carried out against an Iranian nuclear site, because the Israelis, the person that caused the explosion inside the site, the Israelis don't do these things without American consent. Especially it happened while the head of the Pentagon was on his way to Israel. Israelis would never do something like that to put their relationship with the United States at risk. So without a doubt, there was a significant amount of cooperation and intelligence exchanges. And this sort of thing creates greater skepticism towards the United States and towards its intentions when it comes to the nuclear deal.
Well,
So
I won't keep
I
you
would
too.
be very careful about predicting the election results.
Just one thing that you briefly shed light on that I think is of quite significant importance is you mentioned the leader, and most people probably outside of Iran will not know who that is or what that position entailed, because of course the president is not the most powerful politician in the country. How much meaningful leeway will he or she have in formulating the direction of the country?
Well, the president, I would say, is the most powerful figure when it comes to day-to-day affairs, because he is the man with the budget. He is the man with the money. The leader, he is, I think, the most important person when it comes to strategic issues. And the leader, of course, in the constitution he is the leader. Ayatollah Khomeini, who led the revolution, he was the first leader. When he passed away, there was a constitutional body that chooses a new leader and can remove a leader. So that constitutional body brought in Ayatollah Khamenei, who is the current leader. Iranian politics is very complicated. And but one thing that to put it very simple, one of the things that we often see in the Western media is that, there's only one, it's a one-man show, and there's, the leader, he calls his shots and all that. Yet at the same time, the very same people who make these arguments about Iran, and it's usually because of their hostility, there's also a paradox in their arguments, because on the one hand, they claim that the leader calls the shots and everything else is just a facade. But on the other hand, they're always very concerned about the elections. So if the elections are not important and there's no real power distributed throughout the system, then why would you care? Or for example, when Ahmadinejad was the president, they'd say he's a threat to the world. Well, how can he be a threat to the world if he's not calling the shots? Or if they're concerned about a hardliner becoming president, as they like to call it, why would they care if he's, if it's a moderate or a hardliner? But in any case, this inconsistency in the narrative is something that they don't look at carefully. You can't have a political system where the presidency means nothing, yet it's also very important at the same time. It doesn't make sense. So just from this inconsistency in the narrative, what I would say is that no, it's not the case that the leader makes all the decisions. And the leader is answerable to a constitutional body that can remove him or choose him. But the presidency is very important. And as I said, the very fact that there's always this concern about who will be the next president in Western circles, that shows that elections in Iran are meaningful. And Iran is a limited democracy. I mean, it has a constitution. It is an Islamic republic. Not everyone can stand as president. There are limitations in the law. I'm not saying it is an unlimited democracy, but I would also point out that the dominant so-called models of democracy that now exist are not total democracies either. I mean, in the United States, you have a choice between Biden and Trump, and I think that for many in the United States, that's not really a choice. So, while I don't want anyone to think that, no, this is some sort of utopian state and, Iran is some utopia, no. But Iran is very different from what many people think. And the very fact that under the most severe sanctions and constant attacks by foreign powers, assassinations, murders, sabotage, confiscation of Iranian assets, constant demonization. Despite all that, the very fact that you see Iran able to continue to exist and to be an important power in the fight, and the key power in the fight against ISIS and Al Qaeda, which was supported by Western powers. And I would, sort of here like to remind your viewers to look at WikiLeaks. The current U.S. National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, on February the 12th, 2012, in an email to Hillary Clinton, who was Secretary of State back then, said that in Syria, Al Qaeda is on our side. So from the very beginning in Syria, almost literally the very beginning, the U.S. was cooperating with Al Qaeda, the same group that a decade earlier had carried out the attacks on New York. And the fight, Iran was able to help defeat ISIS and Al Qaeda because ISIS came out of Al Qaeda, as I'm sure you know. So Iran, despite all the pressure, the animosity, has been able to sustain itself with great difficulty. And when General Soleimani was murdered, you saw the outpouring of emotions and how people came to the streets and participated in the funeral. So it can't be as evil as many would like to present it as being. In let's say my final point, if this is the last question. If it isn't, then it won't be my final point, but maybe the central theme of what I'm trying to say is that Iran is a normal country, and the United States, the things that it accuses Iran of being, a lot of it exists in the United States, and a lot of it exists among key U.S. allies across the world, whether it's Saudi Arabia or Israel or whoever. So I would just advise your listeners and your viewers to rethink how they view in Iran, and I think they could, if they're fair, they would conclude that the image of Iran is not very similar to the reality. You don't have people being being executed on the streets, and that I've never seen a public execution in my life. And once I was on Al Jazeera, and this Iranian who's residing in the West said they have these public executions. Yeah, I said I've lived in this country all my life. I've never seen one. And that person actually lived in Iran for a few years, and he didn't respond to me then because he knew he wasn't telling the truth. But in any case, I can't deal with all the stereotypes now. But my advice would be for people to be more cautious about what they hear about Iran in the so-called corporate media or the public media, or the general narratives on Iran are not necessarily true.
Well, that was, in fact, my final question. So unless you have any other points you want to add.
No, I have nothing more to say. Thank you for inviting me, and I hope you and your viewers have a very pleasant day ahead of you.
Thank you very much again for making the time.
Not at all. Thank you.